political economy for decades. In 1984, the IMF imposed changes on the pricing of cereals in Tunisia, and there were early examples of so-called bread riots that throughout the 1980s occurred across developing countries. Then about a decade later, what you see in the picture is IMF Managing Director Michel Camdessou kind of looking sternly over Suharto while Suharto is signing a very controversial IMF loan to Indonesia in 1997. And these programs, as the cover of this newspaper suggests, or indeed the stern look on Camdessou's face, were associated with a bitter medicine that countries needed to swallow. That is, this package of austerity and structural adjustment. Now, in subsequent years, the IMF softened its tone and became better at public relations. Just a few years later, in the 2010s, here you see Christine Lagarde showing a very different face of the IMF, a much more fun face, where she's dancing with children in an orphanage in Douala in Cameroon. But as you will see in this picture, above the right shoulder of Lagarde, you see an armed soldier, which kind of starts hinting to the point that maybe there is a lot of controversy around what this institution does. If we stay with the example of Cameroon, just digging a bit deeper, we see that Cameroon has been a major recipient of IMF assistance, and it has been one of the top 10 countries over the 2000s and 2010s to implement IMF conditions. Now, what this shows is that Cameroon had to implement more than 600 IMF-mandated conditions in those 20 years. So the issue becomes, are these reforms helpful or are they a hindrance? On the economic front, they're very controversial. You may recall that these types of programs were rolled out in Latin America, in Africa, in Eastern Europe, in the 80s, 90s, even the 2000s. The 80s and 90s are very often referred to as lost decades for development. And these lost decades were actually the decades that many countries, or most countries in the global south, were implementing these structural adjustment programs. But again, the IMF has been trying to distance itself from the legacy of these programs. In the 2010s, Christine Lagarde, when asked, was like, structural adjustment, that was before my time. I have no idea what it is. We don't do that anymore. On the social front, there have also been recurring controversies. What you see here are two highly influential reports by UNICEF from 1987 and 2012, respectively, that try to draw attention to the social impact of these structural adjustment measures and austerity measures. But these debates have not been settled due to various problems. Methodological problems, data-related problems, as well as the fact that the IMF kept changing the names of a lot of its programs, a lot of its lending facilities, thereby making people like Tom and myself who study these things always chasing behind, trying to figure out what's new and what's the same. So exactly with this agenda in mind, what we did for this book is we went to the archives, we collected a lot of loan agreements, more than 6,000 of them, and out of all of them, we extracted the individual conditions that countries needed to implement. So in total, we ended up with almost 66,000 conditions applicable to 132 countries over 40 years. And we organized them in policy areas. So we generated this global burden of adjustment database, which is, and you can access it through the link on your screens, imfmonitor.org. You will find everything, all of the conditions in different formats that might aid your research or your work. And what you see in this map is the uneven spread of adjustment. You see some countries or regions being heavily affected by these types of reforms. You see West Africa, Pakistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Romania in dark red. That means that over those 40 years, it had to implement more than 1,050 conditions. And then in some other areas, you see kind of less IMF involvement. For example, in China and India, there were only a couple of IMF loans in the early 1980s, and they didn't carry a lot of conditions. So we have this diverging experience, which we need to take into account methodologically when we try to evaluate the impact of these policies. So the analytical task for us in this book was to take these IMF-mandated conditions and link them to social outcomes and policies. We did so using primarily quantitative analysis, and we innovated methodologically in ways that I will not cover here, but we describe at great length in the book, exactly to get to the point that of isolating the effects of IMF interventions, right? Because countries that go to the IMF to receive financial assistance are generally already in economic crisis. So we need to account for that fact in order to isolate the impact of IMF programs. If any of you are interested in the methodological aspect of this work, we'll be happy to discuss more in the Q&A afterwards. So having this data set at hand, we asked, is the IMF's treatment maybe worse than the disease itself, than the causes of the economic difficulties? And what we show quite consistently, I'm not going to cover all of this in this presentation for brevity reasons, is that basically heavier IMF loans, the more structural reforms and austerity that a country needs to implement, the more adverse the social impact of these reforms. What you see in this figure, it basically shows that IMF programs with more conditions end up increasing income inequality, or if we shift to looking at health systems and in particular government health spending, we see a similar pattern. So IMF programs with more conditions end up with yielding great reductions in health spending in the global south, health spending measured, government health spending measured as a share of GDP. Now, these policies are very damaging because structural adjustment really affects the long-term social protection trajectories of countries. If these cuts were only temporary, then one could make a credible case that, well, okay, maybe countries go through some tough times and then their spending bounces back after some temporary cuts. But structural adjustment actually aims to change the underlying political economic institutions, change the structures, as the term's ambitions make clear. And this creates permanent scarring in many countries vis-a-vis social protection. So social protection systems are never able to be built up in the first place. Of course, we're talking about many global south countries that have really rudimentary social protection systems. And responding to these criticisms, the IMF has, over the years, tried to address them, to show, let's say, in its own words, a more human face. And it has tried to do so through the introduction of reforms that are supposed to protect social spending from the consequences of austerity. So it has started to impose what it terms social protection floors, so minimum of social spending that governments need to commit to in order to receive financial assistance. So we also wanted to explore that. Well, you know, is it the case that the IMF has really changed the way that it does its business, and that now it has this much friendlier face? And our answer to this is two-pronged. One part has to do with looking at the track record of implementation of these social spending floors. So we collected all of the implementation data, and what we show is very inadequate implementation. Low-income countries in particular, that is the countries that spend the least on social protection measures, so health, education, and other social protection measures, are the ones that have the lowest implementation rates, just 55%. Upper middle income countries meet these conditions about 2 out of 3 times. But digging even deeper, we find that even these social spending floors are extremely inadequate, because they are very often defined in ways that make it extremely easy for governments to meet them. So they're not really adding up to anything aspirational about how social protection should be and could be built up in a country. But what they add up is to a haphazard package of social amelioration measures. So a social minimum generally targeting very specific, quote unquote, vulnerable groups, while never really aiding countries to build up universal social protection policies that we know are the only policies that in the medium to long run can help countries build up better social protection systems that are highly effective in terms of population outcomes. So the book, for the most part, ends its analysis in 2019. But of course, a lot has happened since 2019, a pandemic, in particular, that thrust many countries in economic crisis, both in the global north and in the global south. And in the aftermath of the emergence of the pandemic, what we see is basically the IMF getting back to the forefront of dealing with these crises. And we saw, after the early wave of temporary assistance, we see, of emergency assistance that the IMF provided, we now see a large wave of very traditional lending agreements by the IMF that carry exactly these kinds of conditionalities that have the negative social consequences that we describe. So in a way, what we are seeing is that austerity is no longer a thing of the past. It's actually very much here with us. The data, this is very recent data from the IMF itself, comparing government spending projections for 2024 compared to the average of the 2010s. So we are excluding kind of the hike in government spending due to COVID. And we see that more than half of developing countries, or about half of developing countries, 59 out of 125, will be spending less. The governments will be spending less in 2024 than they did on average over the 2010s. And this will expose a total of about 2 billion people to the socioeconomic consequences of austerity. Now, as I say this, it's important to remember that for many of these countries, austerity is not something that started to happen after COVID, or indeed just in the past decade. Austerity has been a nearly permanent condition over the last few decades, decimating and devastating public administrations, state capacity, as well as social protection systems. Even very recently, austerity and structural adjustment is making its comeback. Kristalina Georgieva, just a couple of years ago, was saying, well, structural adjustment might actually be a good thing and it's necessary, and we're now giving all of this long-term financial assistance. So we see that after some years of attempting to distance itself from this narrative, the IMF, through its multi-pronged operations in developing countries, is returning to this terminology even, which will have very direct implications for political economies in the global south. And in the book, we try to trace this long arch, basically starting in 1980 or the early 80s with the debt crisis, and ending in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic, and how that has impacted fiscal policy and social expenditures around the world. So I will leave it at this. Thanks a lot for your attention. As Maya said, if you are inclined to order the book, and you're inclined to do so directly from Oxford University Press, you can do so with a discount. And those of you affiliated with universities, many universities get subscriptions to the ebook anyway. So that might be of assistance. Thanks a lot for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Clara, do you want to go next?
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you, Alexandros, and thank you so much, Thomas, for giving us an opportunity to discuss such an important and timely topic. I think your book really gives crucial data to fundamentally reveal how we need a different theoretical framework to understand austerity. Your data clearly shows us how austerity has a devastating impact on the populations. And this is clear. And so it's clear for many of us, but your numbers are really make it such a powerful case. So it's really crucial. This long run empirical work you do is really, really crucial. And I think it points to the reason why we really need to rethink austerity deeply. And this is indeed what I've also tried to do in my own work, The Capital Order. So I would like to put in conversation the two books a bit, because I think A Thousand Cuts really points to a crucial issue, which is that the debate around austerity until this point has been quite depoliticized, in the sense that actually the debate that you showed in your first slides, right, the supposed opposition between the Alesina and colleagues about expansionary austerity, and then the criticism of austerity coming from a Keynesian lens about how austerity has ultimately failed and is ultimately irrational, is, I think, quite a false opposition, because both sides of the debate depoliticize austerity. And what I mean by this is that they view austerity as a neutral toolbox to manage an object, which is an economy that is out there, and thus we fundamentally need to figure out what works and what doesn't to improve the economic indicators, right? And we have Blythe telling us that ultimately, those are just not the correct policies to promote growth and solve the debt issue, which is, by the way, something you clearly show. But I believe the whole point here is that we need to think much more structurally and politically about austerity, to realize that austerity is actually functioning for a much more important fundamental element that is a prerequisite in a capitalist economy. In our globalist capitalist economy, austerity serves to preserve the class hierarchies and to preserve capital as a social relation by which people are forced, compelled, because have no other option but to go sell one capacity to work for a low wage. So austerity is not at all a failure, because it's the logic of austerity is a logic of class subordination, in which we see, as is in the function of capitalism, that there are very few winners and very, very many losers. And so this is really, I think, crucial that we move the conversation about austerity in realizing that austerity is not a bug of capitalism, it's a structural feature. And this is obviously clear by your research that shows how this is even more the case in the south of the globe. And that austerity serves to ultimately increase the market dependence of citizens and make us more vulnerable, trap our capacities to think about alternatives. And this, though, serves the purpose of increasing the profits of the global elite. So I'm sure that a further study could actually really show how in all these countries, also the rate of exploitation and the profit rates go up for those who are actually in power. So this is why I think your work is really crucial to show empirically how we really need to rethink the concept and be much more radical in denouncing the fundamental purpose of austerity. And thus this, I think, can really empower us. I would like also to make a further point before I close, which is the point about the definition of austerity. You, in the introduction, you give a definition that I think is still tied somehow to this classic depoliticized debate about austerity, and I think this also perhaps could be enlarged. And in my own work, I've been thinking about austerity as a trinity of policies. And I think this works well to go beyond what is the typical definition of economists that is accepted, again, both by the expansionary austerity people who are in favor and also by the supposed critics, is the definition of austerity that looks at the economy as an aggregate, not just as an object, again, but also as an aggregate. And this means that it's the definition of austerity is that the austerity is increasing taxes and cutting public expenditures. Now, this definition in itself tells us very little, because the point is not if the state spends or not. The point is where the state spends. And otherwise, you don't detect austerity. There's a lot of countries like the United States that have a huge amount of expenditure going on. But the point is that the state is actively cutting on the social resources, as you showed being a fundamental aspect of structural adjustments in your work, which is really important, while at the same time, the state is spending money on the usual suspects, right? On the military industrial complex, on big banks, on all the financial and economic elites that we know about. So it's fiscal austerity is where the state spends away from the people. Again, this is not stupid. It's logical because it increases the vulnerability of the people and the market dependence. And it's also who the state taxes. It's not just about increasing taxes in general. And I think this also you show that structural adjustment programs are about increasing consumption taxes, right? And decreasing taxes on capital and on wealth of all sorts, right? So again, it's clear that the rhetoric of balancing the budget and curbing inflation has to square with the reality, which is a reality which is much more conserved, again, with stabilizing class relation. This is fiscal austerity, but fiscal austerity is not alone, as also you show in your work. Fiscal austerity goes with the other two elements of the Trinity, which are, first of all, industrial austerity, very, very important, the state actively intervening to curb the bargaining power of labor. So privatization, as Larry Summers puts it, and you show, and deregulation of labor. Labor flexibility. These forms of state interventions that directly go and fundamentally diminish work security is crucial to austerity. And again, this makes a lot of sense because you have to incentivize private investment while making sure that workers don't go on strike, something that is definitely something that the IMF is worried about. And then finally, last but not least, monetary austerity. And this is something that, again, shows once more, as you pointed out, how austerity is back in as the queen of all policies right now with increases in interest rates. And these three elements of the Trinity work in unison and actually reinforce one another, right? And we know that increases in interest rate, again, you can say it's to curb inflation, but what's fundamentally happening is that in order to curb inflation, you're relying on curbing the bargaining power of workers once again, right? Increasing the unemployment rate. So once more, how fiscal and monetary policies are impossible to be understood as separate from labor relations, class relations, and ultimately how this austerity trinity, once more, is something that is intelligent for the type of system we work in. Now, the real question, I think, is the question that you raised towards the end of the book is, so what do we do about this? Given that austerity is explicitly showing how capitalism, as at least our current form of capitalism, has no vision, and it's actually willing to fundamentally go towards destruction, and that is, of course, suffered by the weak on the planet, what can happen? So my question to you is, how much do you think an actually internal reform of the IMF that you kind of push for towards the end, and denouncing very importantly how it has been a fake, let's say, distancing from austerity. Austerity is more than ever present. How is this internal reform going to take place in the face that we are under a globalized capitalism that is clearly not showing any vision, and it's actually clearly showing a suicidal instinct that is more than ever obvious in this historical moment? Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you both so much. I guess, Kate, we'll just take questions at the end, and maybe Alex and Thomas, you can also respond to the questions that Clara put forward at the end. But for now, Kate, go ahead.
Thanks so much. And yeah, thanks so much to Phenomenal World for hosting us. I'm super happy to be here as a big fan of both this book, but also the work of the other panelists here. So just to kind of set expectations, I'm here as an advocate, not an academic. So my perspective is very much of someone who is trying to push the IMF on these issues, who's trying to change the behavior of the IMF, both through my work at Oxfam and like more broadly in civil society coalitions, trying to raise the alarm and trying to make the case for change. So very much my reflections will come from that particular positionality that I have. So I wanted to just kind of focus on two kind of questions really in my response here. So one, to kind of dive in even deeper into this question of like, has the IMF really changed? And then secondly, to answer the question, well, kind of, if not, why not? And what can we do about it, essentially? And I think the book gives us really useful fuel to answer both of those questions pretty conclusively. So as Maya mentioned at the beginning, I just got back from Marrakesh, from the World Bank IMF annual meetings. So in order to kind of illustrate this question of, has the IMF really changed? I thought it might be useful just to kind of posit a couple of quotes that I heard throughout the week that maybe give us quite a damning answer to this question. So the first one came from when the IMF was presenting its new fiscal monitor report, which for those of you, it's a kind of flagship report that the IMF produces each year. This year's has calls for fiscal tightening all the way through the report. And in the press conference, when they were launching the report, a journalist asked Victor Gaspar, who's the head of the fiscal affairs department at the IMF, asked him, like, is it really wise to be returning to austerity now? And Victor Gaspar's response was, we're not calling for austerity. We just want fiscal tightening and fiscal discipline, which he then characterized as a return to normal policy. I think we can all argue about the semantics here, but I think it's very clear that fiscal discipline and fiscal tightening is just kind of old wine in a new bottle for the IMF. And the second quote that I wanted to flag to you, it was in a meeting with Chatham House Rules, so I won't say who said it, was a very, very senior person at the IMF, in response to a question made by an advocate from the North Africa region who had presented really damning evidence of the social impacts of austerity in Tunisia and Egypt. This very senior person at the fund responded, and this is a verbatim quote, "Well, the middle classes always suffer in a crisis. It's just the fiscal math." So I think this really illustrates the extent to which the IMF is still very much relying on these very old paradigms and this very old vision, and is not willing to kind of embrace different policy solutions, and is still very much falling back on this idea of like, there is no alternative to austerity. So those are just kind of two anecdotes, but so, you know, obviously we can't just rely on those anecdotes, and we need to dive more into the numbers. And obviously Thomas and Alex's book, I think, does that incredibly well. But just to kind of hone in on one particular kind of plank of the IMF's claim to have fundamentally changed, which Alex mentioned in his presentation, which is this idea of the social spending floors. So these have been around for a while, but in 2019, there was a kind of shiny new strategy from the fund, which claimed to be really strengthening these social spending floors. And, you know, you find now in conversation with the fund, whenever you're kind of pushing them on austerity, this is always what they roll out to respond to you, to say, oh no, but look, you know, we have these social spending floors now, we've totally changed. But actually, if you kind of look into the numbers of these social spending floors, you find really the kind of big hole in the argument. And these are some numbers that actually Thomas and Alex helped us at Oxfam crunch, which show basically for every $1 that the IMF claims to be kind of encouraging countries to spend in social spending, they're actually forcing or encouraging another $6 worth of cuts through other means. This number comes from a review of 20, Alex, you could probably tell me better, 20-something countries since 2020. So this is post the shiny new social spending floors, and it's countries with IMF loan programs. So, you know, you see this kind of siloed little approach that may have good intentions, but it's not looking at the much broader aspect, the much more holistic aspects of like what an IMF program is doing to that country and the level of spending cuts that are still being asked. And we're also seeing, you know, when we talk to the IMF about these, we're also pointing out that these social spending floors are like super inconsistent and illogical. So, for example, in some countries, the social spending floors include public sector wage bills, and in other countries they don't. And our question to them is like, well, how do you expect to kind of protect, you know, these social indicators and social welfare if you're not even including like the salaries of nurses and doctors and teachers in what you consider essential to kind of realize those rights and to protect those social indicators. So secondly, I kind of want to come to the question, and finally want to come to the question of, okay, so if the IMF doesn't seem to be really fundamentally changing, kind of why is this and what can be done? And again, like very much from an advocate's perspective. So, you know, we always hear from the IMF, you know, yes, this idea that there is no alternative. You know, we hear something that's raised in the book too, this counterfactual of like, okay, well, things are bad, but things would be even worse if the IMF hadn't come in to kind of solve this economic crisis. And we also really hear that those of us who kind of vocally criticize the IMF and its conditionality, that we're being ideological, whereas they're being pragmatic. But, you know, as the book really forcefully shows, like the evidence is not on their side. So like, how can we reconcile this? And even by their own measures of success, I think it's worth saying, like, austerity isn't working. Like we saw this, you know, they've now admitted that it doesn't really help to kind of improve debt sustainability, for example. So like, then why aren't we winning? I think is always my kind of fundamental question, like, why aren't we winning this argument? And I think I would really, you know, obviously there's a million different ways you could answer this, and it's something that we're thinking about constantly. But, you know, firstly, I think I would identify two things. Firstly is like, yes, we need better and more granular evidence. And this is what I find so exciting about this book, because I think it does provide like really irrefutable kind of evidence, with especially that isolates the IMF effect, which really helps us as advocates to kind of disprove the IMF's analysis and their point. And I think for Oxfam as well, especially the findings on economic inequality are really, really crucial. Like there's a chapter in the book, for those that haven't read it, which shows very conclusively that kind of IMF interventions do increase economic inequality, something which the IMF likes to deny stringently. But I'd also, and to come to my kind of final point, like, I'd also like to say that as advocates, we need to be much more savvy and political, and this goes to Clara's point as well, because I think this debate has been depoliticized and we need to repoliticize it. So we need to be armed with this really rigorous, brilliant evidence. But, really what I would do if I could rule the world, I would put both Alex and Thomas's book and Clara's book in the hand of every kind of single IMF advocate or advocate against austerity, because we need to understand that both austerity is both a political and an economic project, and we have to kind of tackle it as such. So that's why I think really when we're fighting against IMF imposed conditionality and austerity, it really needs to go hand in hand with a more political fight at the national level, but also a more political fight for bigger structural reforms, including on governance at the IMF. Thanks.
Great. So last but not least, Mona, take it away.
So thanks, everyone. Delighted to be here. I want to second, Kate, your lovely suggestion that we book bomb each and every office of the IMF, go through the floors and leave your 2 books, because it's been fascinating reading the books and how you also, Clara, touch upon politicizing austerity. And I think you provide the evidence. And I want to actually talk about why I found this book so fascinating. I think, first of all, it's a really important book. It provides original research on all policy conditionalities for 40 years. So you have like 66,000 conditionalities across 132 countries. And you tell us that, the structural adjustment programs varied across the world. But what we get from your takeaway is that the domestic policy environment that they shape changed for the worse. And then you provide us this fascinating institutional history of this mainstay of global governance. And it's just an interesting history that we don't know about, that there was this pluralism, this opening in the 1970s, and all of that was eradicated, or, for that Margaret Thatcher, Reagan-esque ideological purity of the 1980s. Where it's all about austerity. But I do think, despite all the bleakness, I was feeling with a lot of hope reading your book, because I thought, here you are identifying the strengths of the IMF. And I have to say, personally, I too am a reformist rather than a radical, because I think they're very powerful tools, such as the special drawing rights that the IMF has, and other institutions don't have that kind of magic money. So how do we harness that, right? I'm being a reformist in that sense. I think your suggestion, in fact, is let's get rid of the conditionalities, right? And you also do show us that conditionalities over time did change. Back in the days, they were targeted, they were quantitative targets, right? So it was an ends-based policy, like let's reduce the fiscal deficit and monetary, the money supply for a year while providing lending, to the more 3-year programs that involve fiscal consolidation and the privatization of core national firms. And you've lost, when you do those 3-year structural adjustment programs, you lose state capacity that you tell us, right? You lose that institutional knowledge, and you lose institutions to the private sector. And Alex knows as well, coming from Greece. And so I think very forcefully you make the argument that reforming the IMF should mean removing loan conditionalities, and you provide the evidence that we do so. And you want to talk to the policymakers, you do provide some suggestions, which is that at least we can think about these conditionalities. The blanket ones is the fiscal equivalent of, say, carpet bombing. So instead of that kind of approach, let's think about more targeted conditionalities. But I think there's a very forceful case made here to remove the number and the scope of conditionalities, as well as their underlying logic, which Clara's book emphasizes, as does work by Daniela Gabor on the big green state. We don't want to lose that public knowledge and institution memory. I think there's a sliver of hope in the self-recognition of the IMF per se, post-2008, when they granted, right, no conditionality lending. However, that brief moment, like that opening, was lost. And now we've seen, as you mentioned earlier, Alex, this back to things, back to business with the standard conditionality loan agreements. what I found interesting, I didn't know reading your book, was that the bulk of austerity policies are aligning, the external debt constraints of the economy. So trying to avoid defaulting on external debt. And so that is really critical to imposing austerity measures. And then, of course, you tell us this wave of contraction to come across 86 countries, 2.3 billion people, particularly Southeast Asia and North and Central Africa. And here, I think what's really important in your research as well is to make a distinction between middle-income countries who will be facing the bulk of fiscal contraction and not having the accessibility to emergency lending, right, or idea relief through the World Bank. And so what this implies to me is that, low-income countries, first of all, let's talk about those, because 1/5 of low-income country external loans are to the private sector, right? The bulk of low-income country loans are to bilaterals and multilaterals, which makes the case for multilateral agencies also being on the hook for debt relief. They need to participate in that game. There's been a lot of reluctance to do so. But then for middle-income countries that are going to be seeing the wave of austerity in the next decade, I think the very forceful policy proposal is that we need to provide concessional financing. And to me, and also things like capital controls, by the way, right? Not just sort of blaming the global south for not raising taxes as a share of their GDP, right? We understand that's low, it's 10% of GDP in Pakistan, for instance, but the issue is the bigger tax havens in the global north, right? Or that are participating in those networks. And then you talk about the importance of, I want to talk about the importance of the special drawing rights. And I just want to close with that because I want to look at the time here. And, we have in the United States, like just lying in our coffers, right? 162 billion, I checked last night, of special drawing rights. They are bolstering the United States net international investment position, its asset stocks, but the US issues dollars. It doesn't need SDRs. And I understand all the whole legal, reluctance based on legal arguments. And Lagarde has also said, the ECB can't rechannel those SDRs. But here's the thing, for the global north, right, there's this immense elasticity of both liquidity through various swap lines and as well as the law. So now in this time of polycrisis, why not extend that to the global south? Some elasticity in the shape of special drawing rights that can be rechanneled. We're talking about $300 billion that are lying unused that can easily be rechanneled. Why not do that? As the world burns. And finally, I want to ask you, this is a point that Clara, you raised as well. And here's a question to you guys, which is austerity intelligent policy? And how is it going to hurt the IMF? This whole back to business as usual. How's it going to hurt the IMF itself, especially its core leadership? We're talking about the G10 10 donors, for instance. So I'll leave you with that question.
Great, thank you all so much. That was all fantastic. So Alex and Thomas, maybe you can just respond to some of the questions that were raised. And then in the meantime, if people in the audience have questions, you can just put them in the chat and we'll take them afterwards.
Thanks. Let me take a couple of points that were raised, and Tom will jump in with comments on the questions that are in the Q&A box. And please, we do encourage you to add more questions. And let me respond on a few things first that Mona, then Kate, and Clara mentioned. So, Mona, you mentioned this issue around the domestic policy environment, right? And how there are these long-term effects of IMF policies. Of course, here we need to remember that the IMF was never set up to be permanently involved within countries, right? It was set up to provide temporary assistance to countries in need. The fact that in many low and lower middle income countries, the IMF has a near constant presence. And, we were looking at the data in sub-Saharan African countries, often the only years without IMF programs are years of conflict, right? So the fact that the IMF has this near constant presence is in and of itself a sign that its policies aren't working, right? If the policy package that the IMF is promoting was a successful one, then that would alleviate the need for IMF intervention in the first place. And that's not at all what we're seeing. And you make this very interesting point around reformism. And I'll tie this back to what Clara said in a moment. And I guess taking where Kate ended with some of Clara's points, let me say that there is this tension in the book that we never quite make explicit, which I think Clara picked up on, which is that we are taking the system as it is, right? That this is the IMF and this is what it's doing. Can it do what it does in a less damaging way? So that's kind of the underlying idea of the book. What the book doesn't ask is this altogether system the right system to have, right? And this ties to Kate's point, because Kate mentioned the governance issues. I mean, we are in a world where, if I'm not mistaken, I last checked a couple of years ago, but a country like Belgium has as much voting rights as Turkey has, right? So we're in this bizarre world where small, rich, open economies have a disproportionate say in what the institution is doing. Is the institution, Clara really pushed us on the distributional side of things, and if I may summarize it as the IMF being the disciplinary tool of kind of, let's say, the global elite, or the rich countries and the rich people within the rich countries in particular. And I think that's a very, very important discussion. But this really takes us back to the question of, okay, then what is to be done? My own take, and I think I speak for Tom as well on this, is that the global economy needs an IMF-type institution. The Global South has tried to create alternatives to the IMF, generally not very successfully. The only somewhat successful case is the Latin American Reserve Fund, but that really gives very little, has a very limited firepower. Even the alternatives that the BRICS countries are putting in place are dependent on the IMF. So to get assistance from, say, the balance of payment support of the BRICS Bank, you need a parallel IMF agreement. And the same is true for many of the regional financial arrangements as well. So, in a way, my take is that what the IMF does is epiphenomenal to global level power relations, right? So I do understand kind of the danger on a book exclusively on the IMF of somehow muting or neglecting the very serious global politics around it. What the IMF does is neither, was not passed on from God. These are policies that rich countries transformed the IMF into becoming an advocate of, right? So structural adjustment, and I have different work on this, but structural adjustment was a policy package that was pioneered by countries in the global north, right? For many reasons, but not least because they saw the IMF as a very helpful institution in order to be able to enforce certain policies that they themselves cannot enforce. Now, this takes us to kind of other types of debates around empire, informal empire, and formal versus informal empire, and how international institutions help serve a function that colonial institutions used to serve before, and what types of policies they advocate and they enforce, they impose on countries. So I do very much understand this question, but all I can say to this is that the governance question, and I'm sure both Kate and Mona have thought a lot about this vis-a-vis the IMF, is a question in and of itself that attracts really kind of difficult global level politics that we see even currently around debates on IMF reform and very problematic US politics on that side as well, and the US blocking any type of meaningful reform. I can come back to the governance questions, but as we're running out of time, maybe let me pass on to Tom to respond to some of the questions in the Q&A box.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you also, everyone. I just will tackle a few of these questions quite quickly as we're of time, and I wanted to tackle here, and thanks Damien King for a question that's asking, does the methodology include looking at controls of countries with similar starting conditions like fiscal deficits and so on? And the answer to this is that we use, I don't want to go into too much detail, but we use multivariate regression analysis for the causal analysis. So we are controlling for initial conditions, which include the government balance, amongst various other conditions. The specific controls vary by the outcome we're interested in. We use the academic and policy literature to find what the typical controls are. For example, we would look also at gross domestic product per capita initially, the urban population as a share of total population, because that's also relevant for health spending, the occurrence of war and trade and so on. So we are including the various controls, and we do also account for reverse causality using more complex models in doing so. And so we are able to account for differences of the starting levels within the countries that go that are on IMF interventions, but we also can account for those groups that choose not to go onto IMF interventions in spite having similar or indeed different conditions. So this is all in the chapter on the methodology that goes through these various iterations on what can be controlled in this strategy. There's a question here by Patrick Levine Rose, and thank you very much for this question. This is talking about the IMF's 1 trillion firepower and how it was deployed during the COVID crisis. We do have a chapter that covers the COVID crisis and where a lot of this lending goes. And Patrick mentions in the question, did not most of this go to Latin America? And that's true. Latin America, Chile, and several others had large flexible credit loans. These were loans that they did not necessarily draw from, but these weren't quite the emergency loans that most countries got. What happened was a lot of countries initially got what was akin to a grant. These were low-income countries, which was effectively paying off the interest those countries accrued on previous IMF loans for a couple of years. They also had additional loans, which you correctly mentioned in this question, the rapid financing instrument, or the rapid finance, or the RFI, also the rapid credit facility, or the RCF as well. And these are short-term rapid loans that typically, as you say, did not have loan conditionality. But the countries reached their limits on those loans during the COVID crisis. And so what's happening now is a lot, indeed most of these countries, have since shifted on to fully fledged IMF programs with fully fledged loan conditionality, and they can be envisaged to be on these for sometimes up to 4 years, and countries may even renew them beyond them. So that looks like the outlook for the next 5 to 10 years. In addition, and as you point out, it also means that these loans have to be repaid. Only a very small portion of the COVID lending was credit that did not have to be repaid. And that was, as I said, the interest accrued on pre-existing loans with the IMF that was forgiven for those 2 years. So it kicked the can down the road. So that's very problematic. And we can expect austerity in those in a lot of those countries that will move on to those long-range programs. There is a question here by Patrick Levin-Rose, your question again on, can we tie this research to the situation we've seen in the Eurozone where bankers and bondholders get liquidity and stimulus bailouts, whereas the majority of the population gets austerity and in some cases regime change. So a couple of points on this. One, in separate research, myself and colleagues have looked at the relationship between austerity and social conflict, and I don't think it would surprise you to learn that, we run the fancy econometric methods and find that indeed austerity prompts social conflict. But the reasons why are quite interesting and tie back to the chapter on inequality in the book, and that is when we look at the extent of fiscal adjustment required, the more the fiscal adjustment that's required, the more that the income is concentrated into the top 10, to the top decile of income earners, so the top 10%. So this is indeed a situation where the rich maintain or indeed get richer, whereas the poorer deciles lose out in their income share. And so this kind of coheres with what you see in a number of countries and obviously prompts social discontent and possibly even regime change as a result. I believe there's a final question by Pavlos Rolfus. Sorry if my pronunciation is incorrect. And the question here is talking about a very good question, which is about whether social movements changed, in effect, the conditions that are included in the actual program. Now, this isn't a question we address directly in the research. We look at the conditions and then evaluate the results of the conditions as they are. But in saying that, we do have various controls for social and economic conditions, which may control for some of these issues. But in general, this is research that other scholars have investigated and addressed elsewhere. But thank you very much for those questions. I'm not sure, Alex, if there's additional points you want to add in regards to this question.
Maybe a couple of points as we wrap up. On Pavlos's question, so no, we didn't look at this. I know that a few years ago, maybe 2, Oxfam wrote this report on IMF's engagement, not with social movements, but with civil society. And I think well, the report is called From Stunt to Substance. So I think you can easily look it up, and maybe there are some interesting points there. Of course, how the IMF engages with social movements is also an interesting research area in and of itself, and its strategic engagement with some types of social movements and not others, but that is nothing that we have looked at ourselves. And then maybe a final point on Patrick's point on the IMF offering 1 trillion. Now, this 1 trillion lending firepower of the IMF that was very often repeated in the aftermath of the pandemic. I mean, it's true that that is a lending firepower, but that is including the amount of money that is available or potentially available to high-income countries, right? So if we only look at low and middle-income countries, the lending firepower of the IMF is actually quite a lot less than that. Yeah, I think that's it from me, and we're almost on time for the 10 past mark. And
yeah,
but thank you very much to everyone for your comments and the engagement. And as ever, if anyone in the audience has any questions or questions about the data or about the methods, feel free to get in touch. All of the data and the statistical code that we use is public. So you're very welcome to get in touch with us, and we'll be happy to help.
great. Thank you all. This was fantastic. Unless we have any last minute comments from the panelists, I don't know. Any closing remarks? Otherwise, oh, yes, go ahead, Kate.
Yeah, I would just say one thing, and I promise Alex and Thomas aren't paying me to say this, that all this talk of econometric analysis can sound very off-putting to some people, but I want to reassure people I am not an economist, and I did understand the book, and it is genuinely like very readable, and the main messages are very clear. So I would encourage people who feel scared usually to read books full of econometric analysis to get over their fear and to look at it anyway.
Great. Thank you all so much. This was fantastic. And I'm just going to put the discount code again in the chat, and also the link to sign up to our newsletter for anyone who's interested. And yeah, thank you.
Thanks to everyone. For those of you who sacrifice their lunch break to listen to us, if you're in the Americas or other time zones, thanks for joining in.
Take
Thank
care.
you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.